All right. Let's talk this morning about 2 Peter. Last week we talked about 2 Peter chapter 2, and we did verses 1 through 3, right? And we saw what we could expect from false teachers. And what we could expect from false prophets. Let me just read it again. There were indeed false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them. And they will bring swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved ways, and the way of truth will be maligned because of them, and they will exploit you in their greed with made-up stories. Their condemnation, pronounced long ago, is not idle, and their destruction does not sleep. Peter is putting up a sign that says danger, right? Danger this way, right? These false teachers, they regularly deny the master. They're denying who he is. They're saying that Jesus is only one of among many teachers, or that maybe his death really didn't pay the price, right? That's what he says in verse 1. False teaching will encourage these disgusting practices, he says. Now, he doesn't quite get into what that is just yet, but he's going to warn that the way of truth is being blasphemed. And outsiders are going to look at these would-be false Christian teachers, and they're going to find them this soft target. Because these teachers are not teaching the truth. They're teaching a half-truth that then is not logically consistent. And so outsiders are going to look at that and say, that's not consistent with anything. Not with itself. It's not internally consistent. It's not logically consistent. And so they're going to tear them down. And finally, in verse 3 there, they're going to use their fake prophecies or fake teachings as a way to make income, right? This is especially popular in our day, right? Where there's nothing like some strange new idea to get people buying the book you just wrote, right? Or a lecture, coming to a lecture that you're giving. Of course, we don't call it a lecture anymore. We call it a rally, whether it's politics or something else. Jordan Peterson, something like that, right? This week, as we're looking at 2 Peter 2 now, we're going to see what we can expect from God. We see what we expect from the false teachers. They're denying the master, and they're saying that Jesus really didn't pay the price. Now we're going to see what God is going to do about those situations. Divine justice has already happened in 3 different ways, Peter says. One, right? Fallen angels, they were banished. You remember that story, right? Everybody remembers that story? No? Genesis chapter 6, right? The Nephilim, all those sorts of things. He gives us some information that's not in Genesis. We're going to talk about that. Fallen angels were banished. Noah and the flood, and then Sodom and Gomorrah. We often associate Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah with divine justice, but we don't often associate Genesis chapter 6 with that. So Peter's going to begin a trend of thought here that doesn't really culminate until later on in the chapter, in verses like 9 through 10, 11, 12. And that theme is that the wicked will not go unpunished. That's one objective. Intertwined with that, though, is a second objective, and that is to show how God protects and preserves the righteous. The wicked won't go unpunished, and God will protect and preserve the righteous. Those are the two thoughts. And if you remember last week and the week before, we talked about being as innocent as a dove and as wise as a serpent. Those are the two thoughts here that are going to kind of go along with what we're talking about. I'm not going to bring it up again until the end, but I want you to think about that in the meantime. Divine justice, how it has two aspects. Show how God protects and preserves the righteous, and how the wicked will go and be punished. So, the idea that the wicked will be punished is actually a very common theme in Jewish literature, especially Jewish literature of Peter's day. Take the story of Enoch and the Watchers. This is the story we're talking about here, that Peter's talking about in the first story that he's going to talk about here in verse 4. For if God did not spare angels who sinned, but cast them into, most Bibles will say, hell. The word there, the Greek word, is the only time it's used in the New Testament, is Tartarus. I'll mention it again later, but just keep that in mind. This is a very specific mention of a place that these angels are being sent to, that we often translate as hell. So let's get to the story, though, of Enoch and the Watchers. And this story originates from the book of Enoch and some from the Bible. So let's do a quick recap of that story if we remember what it was about. I've talked about it before because that's what Peter's talking about here today. And that is, the story is this, very simple. Enoch is a righteous man, and he is the seventh person after Adam. Hint, hint. 7 is very special in Hebrew literature, right? Enoch is chosen by God in this book of Enoch. That's not in our Bible. He's chosen by God to witness these divine mysteries. And the Watchers are this group of rebellious angels who descend to earth, who take human wives, just like Genesis 6, and they produce a race of giants called the Nephilim. That's also Genesis 6. And their actions corrupt humanity, is the idea. They defy the divine order that God has set, that spiritual beings are supposed to be in heaven and human beings are here on earth. And that leads to this widespread wickedness over the earth, because these Nephilim are giants. They're big. They do whatever they want. They take advantage of people. They crush their people they're going against and take their land. There's widespread wickedness on earth, just like in Noah's day. Noah is first mentioned in the lineage in 5, but he doesn't come around until 6, 7, 8, and 9. And Enoch serves as this intermediary between God and these fallen angels. He's like a preacher to them. He preaches to these angels and he delivers warnings about their impending judgment, and they don't repent. And God ultimately punishes these angels, these watchers, by imprisoning them in chains, and sends the great flood to cleanse the earth of their offspring. All the while, Enoch is taken to heaven, where he's transformed into this spiritual being, celestial being, I don't know what to call it. And so the story, this narrative, explores several different themes. And the main theme is divine justice and human sin, and how God will not tolerate this human sin, or cosmic sin, cosmic rebellion, the sin of other Elohim, other spiritual beings. All right, so that's the story of Enoch. That's what Peter is referencing here. that we don't get anywhere else in the Bible. The blanks are not filled in anywhere in our Bible, but they are in the story of Enoch and the Watchers in the book of Enoch. So the result, what Peter is saying here is that through these stories, we can now read the ancient Hebrew scriptures knowing the end of the scriptures from the beginning. We know the end because we flipped to the end. We read the New Testament. So now we know how the story ends up. And now we can read the scriptures and understand more about what it is they're trying to say. We have this God-given hindsight now. And that's what he's going to bring out today. We can see with God-given hindsight everything that was coming together at the point of this Messiah, Jesus, and when he emerged, and the revealing of God's glory in him, in that Messiah, goes closely with that promise that we too can share in that divine nature. That's the promise from chapter 1, right? This letter is unique in that particular aspect, that it brings together those two ideas, the promise of a Messiah and our sharing of his nature. That wasn't something that they found in the Old Testament. This Messiah was supposed to come and do everything for them, was the idea. Let's back up, though. Remember those false teachers from last week, right? Their skepticism of Jesus' return and their love of sin without consequences was just too convenient. They could reject biblical authority. They could reject what Jesus taught. They could reject what the prophets taught and get rich doing it with that false Christian message of freedom, their false version of it. They could have lots of casual sex and without any fear of accountability or judgment. It was that classic, we have a saying for it, you can have your cake and eat it too. Right? But Peter is not going to have any of that. Right? He condemns them here in chapter 2. And he reminds the people that are reading his letter, us and the people of his day, he reminds us that God's judgment is certain. That God's judgment on wickedness is promised. It's going to happen. And to make his case, he follows this rabbinic formula of proof, right? It moves from a minor to a major premise. From a minor something to a major premise. Using that formula now, he's going to pull from these notorious stories in the Bible that we talked about to really just knock it out of the park. If God did not spare fallen angels, the ancient civilization in Noah's day, or Sodom and Gomorrah, then how much more so will he bring this certain judgment on these false teachers who claim to be Christians but who reject the faith? That's the argument that Peter is making here in 2 Peter 4 through verse 4. It's interesting that we bring this up because if you talk about other people outside of the Bible and how they viewed Genesis 6, the story of these fallen angels, Josephus, the historian from about the time of Jesus, recognizes the similarity between Genesis 6 and this Greek legend of these giants. I'm going to read a quote from what he wrote. He says the deeds of that tradition ascribes to them resembles the audacious exploits told by the Greeks of the giants. That's in his book called Antiquities, the first book. And so Peter uses this example that was readily recognized by the Greeks and the Jewish hearers. They just saw two different events. But Peter was using an event they might have heard about, and that was very similar to the story in the Bible, to appeal to this common knowledge about divine punishment on the wicked, right? And so what all three of these examples have in common is that when God calls a people, if you are not obedient to that call, those people will be rejected, even if that is the nation of Israel. So we need to talk about 2 Peter and his relationship with what we call the book of Jude. It appears that Peter is quoting from the book of Jude because there is some very, very similar language here we're going to see in the next few verses. So let's talk about verse 4 now. Verse 4 says, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but handed them over, casting them into Tartarus in chains of darkness to keep them for judgment." Now I put Tartarus in there. That could be hell, if you're going to translate it that way. And in Jude 6 it says, "And angels who did not keep their position, but left their proper abode, he is keeping in everlasting chains in darkness for the judgment of the great day." So, actually, if we back up and we look outside the Bible, there is a great number of Second Temple Jewish literature where you will find this story. It's not just the book of Enoch. And there's no ambiguity. All the stories are very, very similar up until the 2nd century AD, right? Everybody understood that the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 were supernatural angelic beings. For thousands of years, everybody knew that. So here, Peter is borrowing heavily from another piece of 1st century Jewish literature, that is Jude, verses 5 through 8. And even though both authors are turning to the same event, they use them a little bit differently, right? Jude's example deals with the judgment on the Exodus generation. But Peter's letter is arguing more generally for the principle of God's just judgment against anyone who denies God, and how there is surely a just coming judgment for denying God. And so Peter here in his second letter is purposely following the sequence of events in the early part of Genesis. He's going to stress God's judgment, but God's judgment is not always negative. Remember? It repays the wicked, but it also rescues the righteous. So Peter follows Jude's account of punishment of the angels, repeating how God keeps them in chains and darkness for judgment. There's lots of overlapping words here. Peter, though, he puts them in this place called Tartarus. And that is the Greek name for the underworld of which story? Can you take a wild guess? Probably the one I just mentioned about the Greek giants. When those Greek giants come, they fight a battle with the gods, and then Zeus eventually kicks them out and puts them in Tartarus. Sound familiar? Sounds a lot like the book of Enoch, right? Which is probably actually older than those Greek myths. So, Peter is using his knowledge of his multicultural audience to appeal to them with a biblical story. He's then going to move on in verse 5 to the flood, which happens later on after the story of these fallen angels. So Peter is going to defend God's just judgment, and that includes rewards for the righteous. And he contrasts Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's Sodom and Gomorrah famous for? What was the judgment that came down? Have you got there yet? What happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? What came down? Bible class kids. That was Jericho. Something came out of heaven onto Sodom and Gomorrah. Not manna. It rained what? Not water. Not humans. Kids. You're teens, not kids. Yes, you are. You're a teen. What did it rain down? Oh. Jonah, think about it. What did it rain down? During the story of the flood, what did it rain down? Water. A lot of rain. What did it rain down in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that destroyed it? What destroyed? Close. That's close. Yeah, fire. It rained down fire and brimstone. Sulfur is brimstone. Sulfur is the same thing you make matches out of that burns, right? And so we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah raining fire, and then we have it juxtaposed with Noah and it's raining water. And they're both the stories of destruction. So we have fire and water as being opposites there. Genesis is actually silent on Noah's preaching. But here in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, and if he didn't spare the ancient world, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others when he brought the flood of the world on the ungodly. So where's he getting this idea that Noah was a preacher of righteousness? Well, just so happens, Book of Enoch. Man, that sounds familiar, right? So the watery and flood in Noah's time is balanced with that fiery destruction of Lot. And so Noah serves as a model for the church, for us, a model of needing to listen to the prophecies of Jesus' return by living this spotless life, like Noah's life. Noah, who is called perfect and who's called righteous, right? Noah illustrates the principle we've already talked about, right? That many are called, but few are chosen, right? Only Noah and 7 others were spared because they were what? They were faithful. They were what? Righteous. Please stop. Because they were faithful to the calling that God called them with. So, Sodom and Gomorrah, we've already talked about it a little bit. I'll just kind of rush through this one a little bit. And if he reduced the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes and condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is coming to the ungodly, and if he rescues Lot, that's the same story, but now it's no longer condemnation. And so divine judgment by water and fire was commonplace, even among the Greek stories. The choice of the examples, though, is one that would resonate in both Jewish and Greek communities. And so Peter is using these stories to reach out into the community and reach Greek ears and Jewish ears. And so this is another example of the multicultural aspect of the Christian message reaching out to the world around them. Again, the same story is talked about in Jude 7. There's a lot of overlap here between 2 Peter and Jude. I wanted to get to this, though. That is the conclusion. And the conclusion is very similar. The conclusion that Peter has already talked about, that these people are doing contemptible things, that they are denying the master, they're denying his authority and who he is. And so Peter is explicitly giving these arguments to prove what these people are contesting. Remember the end of verse 3. Let me look at the end of verse 3 again. Let me read it. Their condemnation pronounced long ago is not idle, nor is their destruction asleep, nor does it sleep. This Peter is giving a theodicy. What was a theodicy? The explanation of why God is good, even though evil exists in this world. And so the argument that the false teachers and the prophets were challenging God with is refuted by Peter in these three examples of judgment. He says, God did not spare. He says it 3 times, right? And the argument concludes with a summary here that God knows how to rescue the godly and to punish the unrighteous. Let's skip ahead now. Well, let me just read. And if he rescues righteous Lot, verse 7, distressed by the depraved behavior of the immoral, for as that righteous man lived among them day by day, his righteous soul was tormented by the lawless deeds he heard and saw. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who follow the polluting desires of the flesh and despise authority. The argument that Peter is making here concludes with this summary that God knows how to rescue the godly and to punish the unrighteous. Jude says the same thing. Nevertheless, these dreamers defile the flesh, that's polluting the flesh, and flout authority. It's the same thing that's happening here in 2 Peter. God says that he especially repays sinners who pollute the flesh. What does that mean? We're talking about sexual immorality here. And especially those who flout authority, those who deny the return of Jesus. Those are Peter's main opponents that he's talking about there, those 2 things. Same with Jude. And so the reason this is so important, and I don't think we get this because we don't live in such a communal society anymore. But pollution is never only personal. Pollution, if I go dump the oil out of my truck in the harbor, who does it affect? Who? Which people? The people who are in the harbor, the whole community, right? Pollution always affects the entire group of people or the entire nation here that we're talking about. The sexual pollution. Because pollution is thought to contaminate not only people, but also the land. And so this is a life or death moral issue that cannot be tolerated. And so it always has to be removed. It has to be cleansed. And so cleansing or purging here means removing the cause of the pollution. Maybe like Ezra, when they had to separate from their foreign wives. It means removing it from your presence. And here in Peter's day, just like in our day, the source of pollution that he's talking about is sexual immorality. The pollution, though, is not just the one or two people that are involved in it. Because what does pollution do? Who does it affect? It corrupts the entire community around them. We're going to get into this next week, but in verse 13, he says, they will be paid back with harm for harm they have done. They consider it a pleasure to carouse in broad daylight. They are spots and blemishes, delighting in their deceptions while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery that never stop looking for sin. They seduce unstable people and have hearts trained in greed. They are children under a curse. The pollution never only belongs to an individual. It always spreads and corrupts the entire community. And it causes us to lose our holiness when we tolerate it. If we skip all the way down to the end of the chapter in verse 20. For if, having escaped the world's impurity through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in these things and are defeated, the last state is worse for them than the first. It causes us to lose our holiness when we get tangled up in adultery, when we get tangled up in sexual immorality. And so when teachers show up, when they emerge, who remove these normal things, these normal constraints, restraints that the Christian faith puts out, when they say, you're free, you can do anything you want, you're a Christian, we need to beware. There's a deadly combination there that Peter points to in verse 10. Especially those who follow the polluting desires of the flesh and despise authority. It would be a very bold person who claimed that none of these problems exist in the church today. It's easy to get on the wrong road. It's much easier than even you might think to go down that pathway. Peter says that even tolerating people who indulge in those things, denying Christ and sexual immorality, that if we just tolerate those people within the church, we lose our own holiness because it's a pollution that spreads to the whole community. And so let's think about the underlying point for today's lesson. And I think he says it very clearly there in verse 9. The Lord knows how to rescue the godly from the trials and to keep the righteous under punishment for the day of judgment. It's a positive message here. You are not left to your own devices, Peter says. You're going to be tested. And yes, wicked and unscrupulous people are going to appear to flourish and do better than you. But God is not mocked. He knows how to rescue his people from the test of their lives. And he knows how to keep the wicked ready for the day of judgment. You remember what I said all the way at the very beginning? That judgment and mercy are these two characteristics. They're like twins, they go together. And they correspond to the command that we should be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Life would be very pleasant if it was all mercy and innocence. Life would be so pleasant if it was all mercy and innocence. But life is not that way. There are bad people in this world that do bad things. And it's easy to get lost and go down that pathway of sexual immorality, of denying God's authority, if we don't have the wisdom part. So my encouragement for you this morning is to be as wise as a serpent, but as innocent as a dove. To rely on God's mercy and his judgment, to know that he has the ability to rescue you. He has promised to rescue you. He has rescued you if you are willing to submit yourself to that rescue plan of being washed in Jesus' blood. If you haven't been submerged, immersed down into the waters and come up a new person in baptism, you have not been joined to his church. You need to be. You need to be. Otherwise, judgment awaits. That's the lesson for today, that God can rescue his people, and he's offered rescue to them. Now, the question is, will you be like Noah? Will you be like Lot? Will you follow after God? Or will you go down that pathway of denying God and sexual immorality into judgment and destruction? That's the lesson for this morning. Next week, we'll look at, starting in verse 11, in 2 Peter chapter 2. It's good to have everyone here this morning. We'll see you all next week. Remind me,